The Hesperus cut through the churning Atlantic swells on the 26th of December 1900, carrying relief keeper Joseph Moore toward what should have been a routine landing at the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. But as the vessel approached Isle Moore, the largest of the 7 desolate islands 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, Moore felt something twist in his stomach. The lighthouse stood dark and silent against the winter sky. No signal flags flew from the mast. No welcoming figures appeared on the landing platform. The island itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Moore knew lighthouses. He knew their rhythms, their sounds, their rigid schedules that kept the shipping lanes safe. And he knew that 3 experienced keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur, did not simply abandon their posts. These men were professionals, trained to withstand isolation, masters of the mechanical precision required to keep the light burning through Atlantic storms that could tear a man from solid rock. Yet as the Hesperus drew closer, as the December wind howled through the rigging and spray lashed the deck, Moore understood with growing certainty that something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong on Flannan Isles. The lighthouse itself stood operational and eerily intact, its mechanisms functioning perfectly. But the men who tended it had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic clues that would haunt investigators for over a century. Inside the keeper's quarters, an overturned chair lay on the floor. A half-eaten meal sat cold on the table. The clock had stopped, and in the logbook, the final entries spoke of storms and fear and something approaching that defied rational explanation. What happened to the 3 keepers of Flannan Isles remains one of maritime history's most chilling mysteries. The answer, if it exists at all, lies somewhere in the howling wind, the crashing waves, and the terrible silence that greeted Joseph Moore that December morning. The silence of men who had simply ceased to exist. The Atlantic has always been cruel, but in the waters off the northwest coast of Scotland, it becomes something more than merely unforgiving. Here, where the Outer Hebrides stand as humanity's last defenses against the endless ocean, the sea transforms into a living thing that devours ships with methodical patience. By the close of the 19th century, these waters had earned their reputation written in the names of vessels that never reached port, in the bodies never recovered, in the wives who watched horizons that would never return their husbands. The maritime charts of the era marked these passages with warnings that sailors understood meant one simple truth: navigate carefully or die. The Flannan Isles rise from these treacherous waters like the jagged teeth of some buried giant, a cluster of 7 uninhabited rocks 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis. For centuries, mariners gave them a wide berth not merely because of the obvious dangers, the submerged reefs that could gut a hull in seconds, the currents that could drag a ship off course in minutes, but because of something else, something the charts could never capture. The islands carried a darkness that preceded any lighthouse, any modern attempt to tame them with Victorian engineering and kerosene lamps. The local Gaelic name for the largest island, Isle Moore, translates simply to Big Island, but among the fishing communities of Lewis, people rarely spoke the name at all. When they did, it came with sideways glances and touches to lucky charms worn beneath heavy sweaters. Shepherds from Lewis would occasionally make the crossing to graze sheep on Isle Moore's sparse grass, but they never stayed after dark. Never. They would row back through dangerous swells rather than spend a night on that rock. And when pressed about their hurry, they would speak of feelings rather than fact. The wrongness of the place. The way sounds seemed to come from directions that made no sense. The sensation of being watched by eyes that existed in no human skull. Ancient stories clung to the Flannans like the salt spray that never quite dried from their rocks. The islands were said to belong to the spirits of drowned sailors, condemned to wander the rocks where their ships had foundered. Some of the older islanders claimed the Flannans were a thin place, where the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond were transparent as morning mist. Phantom lights had been reported for generations, long before any lighthouse stood there, dancing fires that led ships toward destruction rather than safety. One persistent legend spoke of a race of little people who inhabited caves beneath the islands, emerging only during storms to claim offerings or lives, depending on their mood, and the desperation of those who had offended them. The church had tried to sanctify the islands centuries earlier. The Flannans took their name from Saint Flannan, a 7th century Irish bishop, who supposedly sought solitude there for prayer and contemplation. A tiny stone chapel had been built in his honor, though by the 1800s, it stood as little more than tumbled walls and bitter irony. Even God's house could not maintain its roof in that place. Shepherds reported that sheep left overnight would sometimes vanish without trace. No blood, no wool, no sign of struggle. Just gone, as though the island had opened and swallowed them whole. But shipping lanes care nothing for superstition, and by the final decade of the 19th century, the volume of maritime traffic rounding the northern tip of Scotland had grown too significant to ignore. The route from Glasgow and Liverpool to North America passed directly through these waters, and the wrecks continued to accumulate. Insurance companies began pressuring the Northern Lighthouse Board with the kind of mathematical certainty that steamship companies and banks understand better than ghost stories. The loss of cargo and life could be calculated in pounds sterling, and the numbers demanded action regardless of local legend. Construction began in 1895, a monumental undertaking that required shipping every brick, every bag of cement, every tool and timber across 20 miles of hostile ocean to an island that seemed determined to reject human presence. The work could only proceed during summer months, when the Atlantic briefly pretended at calm, and even then, supply ships often had to wait days or weeks for conditions safe enough to approach. Workers reported accidents at a rate that exceeded other lighthouse projects, injuries that seemed almost directed, tools disappearing, rope failures, sudden illness. 3 men died during construction, claimed by falls and crushing accidents that witnesses described as uncanny in their timing and precision. The lighthouse itself rose 75 feet above sea level, perched on a cliff that already stood more than 100 feet above the waves. Its beam, powered by an array of lenses that represented the cutting edge of optical technology, could reach 24 miles in clear conditions, sweeping the darkness with mathematical regularity every 30 seconds. The tower was built from Scottish granite, walls 4 feet thick at the base, designed to withstand anything the Atlantic could throw at it. The Northern Lighthouse Board spared no expense. This lighthouse would be their triumph, their monument to Victorian engineering's conquest of nature and superstition alike. The station required 3 keepers at all times, working in rotation. 3 men would occupy the lighthouse for 6 weeks, while a 4th remained ashore on Lewis, resting before the next rotation. The isolation was absolute. No visitors. No contact, except for the relief boat that came every fortnight in good weather, less frequently when autumn and winter made the crossing impossible. The keepers would be alone with the light, the Atlantic, and whatever else inhabited those rocks. The selection process for Flannan Isles keepers was rigorous beyond the already demanding standards of the Northern Lighthouse Board. This was not a posting for young men seeking adventure or recent recruits learning the trade. The board needed veterans, men whose records demonstrated not merely competence but exceptional psychological resilience. Men who could endure isolation without fracturing, who could maintain absolute reliability in conditions that would drive lesser souls to despair or madness. The pay reflected the difficulty, higher than most other stations, but money alone never attracted the right candidates. These had to be men of particular character. James Ducat was appointed principal keeper, the officer in charge. At 43 years old, he represented everything the lighthouse service valued. He had spent over 20 years tending lights along the Scottish coast, earning commendations for his meticulous maintenance and unshakable calm during emergencies. Married with 4 children, Ducat lived in Stromness when ashore, a steady family man whose wife had long since made peace with his prolonged absences. His logbooks from previous postings read like textbooks in proper procedure, every entry precise, every duty documented with careful attention. Fellow keepers described him as quiet, but not unfriendly, a man who led by example rather than command. He attended church regularly, drank moderately, and harbored no debts. His psychological evaluation noted an almost supernatural patience, and an ability to find contentment in routine that the examining officer described as the perfect temperament for isolated service. Thomas Marshall, age 28, was appointed second assistant keeper, the youngest of the crew, but no less experienced. He had joined the lighthouse service at 19, and had worked his way up through smaller stations with a record that impressed even veteran administrators. Marshall was unusual among keepers in that he possessed formal education, having attended school until age 16, a rarity for men of his class and era. He could navigate complex mathematical calculations required for certain maintenance procedures, and had taught himself basic celestial navigation as a hobby. Letters from his previous supervisors praised his initiative and mechanical aptitude. He had once repaired a damaged clockwork mechanism that controlled a rotating lens, work that should have required a specialist from Edinburgh, but which Marshall completed using improvised tools and pure ingenuity. Married just 2 years, his wife was pregnant with their first child, expected to arrive in the new year of 1901. Donald McArthur served as the regular second assistant, though at 45 he was older than many principal keepers. McArthur had specifically requested assignment to remote stations throughout his career, preferring isolation to the busier lights near populated areas. Some men found community tedious rather than comforting, and McArthur was one of these. He was a religious man, known to read his Bible daily and to spend his off-duty hours in quiet contemplation. Previous keepers who had served with him reported that he could go days speaking only the bare minimum required for professional communication, but that he performed every duty with absolute reliability. He had never married, sending most of his wages to his elderly mother in Stornoway. His personnel file included a note from a previous supervisor. McArthur is perhaps the most self-sufficient man I have encountered. He requires nothing from his fellow keepers, except their professional competence. An ideal temperament for the most isolated stations. These were not desperate men fleeing scandal or failure. They were not dreamers chasing romance. They were professionals, carefully selected, rigorously trained, proven over years of service in conditions that would overwhelm ordinary men. The Northern Lighthouse Board had chosen them specifically because they were men who would not fail, could not fail, men whose stability was documented across decades of flawless service. The lighthouse became operational on December 7, 1899, its beam first cutting through the darkness on a cold winter night while a storm battered the Atlantic. The light performed exactly as designed, visible from shipping lanes that threaded between the Outer Hebrides and the open ocean, a beacon of safety where before there had been only deadly darkness. Ships adjusted their charts. Insurance rates for the passage decreased. The lighthouse worked. But on Lewis, in the small communities where old people still remembered the stories, where the Gaelic language preserved memories that English tried to forget, the mood was less celebratory. They had put a light on Eilean Moor. They had built a house on cursed ground and filled it with men who did not believe, or did not care, about the warnings that stretched back beyond memory. The old women shook their heads. The fishermen touched iron. And when the keepers took their positions in the tower, beginning their rotations of 42 days of isolation, followed by 14 days ashore, people watched the light sweep across the water each night and wondered not if something would happen, but when. The islands had waited centuries. They could wait a little longer. The lighthouse log sat open on the desk, its final words written in steady, unremarkable penmanship. December 15, 1900. The entry was routine, almost mundane in its ordinariness. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. Nothing in those brief notations suggested what was about to unfold. Nothing hinted at the terror, the mystery, or the complete vanishing of 3 experienced men from a stone tower that should have been their sanctuary against the winter storms. The alarm came first from the steamship Arctur, making its way past Eilean Moor on that same December afternoon. The captain expected to see the familiar beam sweeping across the dark waters, guiding vessels through the treacherous channels between the Hebridean Islands. Instead, there was only darkness where light should have been. The lighthouse, perched on its lonely rock 20 miles west of the Scottish mainland, remained utterly black against the evening sky. The captain noted this troubling absence in his own log, marking the time as late afternoon, when the lamp should have already been burning against the gathering dusk. Other ships followed in the days afterward, each reporting the same unsettling observation. The Fairwind passed on the night of December 15th and saw no light. The vessel's mate recorded his concern, noting that the seas were calm and visibility good, no reason whatsoever for the lighthouse to remain unlit. By December 16th, vessels were actively seeking the beam, straining to see that reassuring pulse of light. Still nothing. The lighthouse keepers, whose sacred duty was to maintain that flame through every night without fail, had somehow failed in their most fundamental responsibility. But it would be 11 more days before anyone could investigate. The weather, as if deliberately concealing evidence, turned savage. Winter storms rolled in from the Atlantic, battering the islands with winds and waves that made any approach to Eilean more impossible. The relief boat, scheduled to bring supplies and rotate the keepers as it did every fortnight, sat trapped in port at Brestclete on the Isle of Lewis, waiting for the seas to calm enough to make the crossing. December 26, 1800 hours after the last routine log entry, the relief vessel Hesperus finally made its approach to Eilean Moriarty. Joseph Moore stood at the rail, scanning the landing platform. He was the relief keeper, come to take his rotation on the Light. Moore was a veteran of lighthouse service, experienced in the isolation and demanding routine of keeping the lamps burning. He'd made this journey dozens of times before, knew these waters, knew this lighthouse, knew the men who should have been there to greet him. But there was no one waiting at the landing. No faces appeared at the tower windows. No signal flags flew. Moore felt the first stirrings of unease as the boat approached the concrete pier. The absence of welcome was unusual, troubling. Keepers always watched for the relief boat, eager for news from shore, for mail, for fresh faces and conversation, after weeks of isolation, with only 2 companions. The boat crew helped Moore onto the landing platform. Together they climbed the steep stone steps carved into the cliff face, ascending toward the lighthouse compound. The gate, when they reached it, stood closed. Not unusual in itself, but still, no sound of greeting, no doors opening, no footsteps hurrying to welcome them. Moore called out. His voice echoed off the stone walls of the compound and faded into the wind. No answer came. He called again, louder. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. The boat crew exchanged glances. Something was wrong here. Something fundamental had shifted in this place that should have been filled with routine and order. The gate creaked as Moore pushed it open. Beyond lay the courtyard, neat and orderly. Nothing appeared disturbed. The lighthouse tower rose above them, solid and permanent as the rock it stood upon. Moore crossed the courtyard and reached the main door of the keeper's quarters. Also closed. Not locked, but firmly shut. He turned the handle and stepped inside. The entrance hall revealed nothing immediately alarming. Boots stood in their usual places. Coats hung on pegs. But the silence was absolute and wrong. A lighthouse was never this quiet. There was always the tick of clocks, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of conversation or the clatter of work. This stillness felt like death itself had moved through these rooms. Moore called out again, his voice smaller now, compressed by the narrow hallway. He moved deeper into the living quarters, his unease building with each step. The kitchen came first. Here the signs of abandonment became clear and strange. Dishes sat on the table, a meal interrupted. The kitchen clock had stopped. Its hands pointed to a specific moment frozen in time, though Moore would later struggle to recall the exact hour. What struck him more forcefully was the chair. One of the wooden chairs lay overturned on the floor. Not pushed back carelessly, but actually toppled over, as if someone had stood suddenly, violently. The other chairs remained properly placed around the table. Just this one, lying on its side like a body. Moore stared at it, his mind trying to construct a narrative that would explain such a small but significant detail. He moved through the other rooms methodically now, searching. The sleeping quarters revealed beds unmade, blankets thrown back. The men had clearly risen from sleep, but whether in calm routine or sudden panic, the rumpled sheets could not tell him. Personal items remained in their usual places. Tobacco pouches, books, letters from home. Everything that the men would have valued, would have kept close, all left behind. Moore climbed to the lamp room at the tower's summit. The great lens sat silent and dark, its intricate prisms designed to magnify and project light across 20 miles of ocean. The lamp was trimmed, ready to be lit. Fuel reserves were adequate. Everything was prepared for the night's work, but the work had never been done. On December 15th, for reasons unknown, the keepers had failed to light the lamp, and they had never lit it again. Returning to the living quarters, Moore noticed the coat rack near the entrance. Here hung the oilskins, heavy waterproof garments essential for anyone venturing outside during wet weather. 3 keepers lived on this rock. 3 oilskin coats should hang here, but Moore counted only 1. 2 were missing. 2 men, it seemed, had dressed for weather and gone outside. But the third coat remained. This detail would haunt the investigation more than any other. If all 3 coats were gone, one could imagine the men going out together, facing some emergency as a team. If all 3 coats remained, perhaps the emergency had been internal, within the lighthouse itself. But 2 coats gone and 1 remaining suggested something far stranger. 2 men had prepared for the weather. 1 had not. 1 had rushed out into conditions dangerous enough to require protective gear, but had gone without it. Why? What could compel a man to run into a winter storm without taking the most basic precaution? Moore searched the lighthouse log next, seeking answers in the final entries. The log was the sacred record of lighthouse operation, a document maintained with religious precision. Every watch change, every weather observation, every maintenance task was recorded here. Moore flipped through the pages, reading backward through time. December 14th. Storm continuing. Sea very rough. All 3 men had signed their watch entries. Notes about wind direction, wave height, visibility. Standard observations recorded in the standard way. December 15th. The final entry. Written in the hand of principal keeper, James Ducat, a man with 20 years of lighthouse experience. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. The words were steady, unhurried. There was no indication of stress, no hint of anything unusual. The entry suggested a normal day after the storm had passed. Calm seas should have meant easy work, routine maintenance, the simple task of keeping the lamp burning through another night. But after those words, nothing. The log simply stopped. No further entries. No explanation. No farewell. Moore stood in the lighthouse, reading those final words over and over, as if repetition might reveal some hidden message. God is over all. What had Ducat meant? Was it simply a conventional expression of faith, the kind of thing men said without thinking? Or had he known something was coming? Had he felt some approaching doom and sought comfort in divine providence? The routine nature of that final entry made everything worse somehow. If the log had described some crisis, some emergency, the disappearance would at least have context. But this normalcy, this calm record of a storm ended and seas settling, made the subsequent vanishing incomprehensible. Moore returned outside, the boat crew helping him search the island. They walked the perimeter, checking every footpath, every accessible point. The island was not large, perhaps 500 yards at its widest point. Sheer cliffs dropped into the Atlantic on all sides, except the landing area. There were few places to go, few places to hide. They found nothing. No bodies. No signs of struggle. The crane used to haul supplies from boats sat properly secured. The ropes were coiled, the equipment stowed. Everything suggested men who had followed their training, who had maintained discipline and order even in whatever final moments they had experienced. As darkness approached, Moore knew he had no choice but to stay. The light had to be restored. He sent the boat crew back with news of the mystery, then set about the familiar work of preparing the lamp. That night, for the first time in 11 days, the lighthouse on Eilean Moor burned again, sending its beam across the dark water, guiding ships past the rock, where 3 men had vanished without explanation, without struggle, without leaving any coherent story behind. Just routine words in a logbook, 2 missing coats, and an overturned chair to mark their passing into mystery. The western landing platform clung to the rock face 70 feet above the churning Atlantic, a man-made shelf carved from the ancient stone of Eilean Moor. It was here, on this exposed ledge designed to receive supplies when the eastern landing proved too rough, that the investigation team found their first undeniable evidence that something catastrophic had occurred. What they discovered would challenge everything they understood about the ocean's fury. Joseph Moore stepped onto the platform behind Superintendent Robert Muirhead, the relief keeper's boots finding purchase on wet stone still slick from recent spray. The superintendent had arrived from shore with a team of investigators, determined to make sense of the disappearance that had gripped the nation's imagination. Muirhead was a methodical man, trained in the rigorous standards of the Northern Lighthouse Board, a man who dealt in measurements and facts, in maintenance schedules and regulation compliance. He carried a notebook, its pages already filling with observations, sketches, measurements. He expected to find evidence of negligence, perhaps, or some unfortunate accident. What he found instead would shake his confidence in the very laws of physics he'd always trusted. The damage was immediately apparent, even from a distance. The iron railings that ran along the platform's edge, installed to provide the keepers with something to grip during rough weather operations, had been bent backward. Not merely pushed or loosened, but twisted and contorted as if gripped by some massive hand and wrung like wet cloth. Muirhead approached slowly, running his fingers along the tortured metal. These were not decorative fixtures, but substantial iron bars, each one thick as a man's wrist, anchored deep into the bedrock with bolts designed to withstand decades of Atlantic gales. He produced a measuring tape, calling out dimensions to his assistant. The railings had been forced backward at angles approaching 90 degrees in some places. The bolts securing them had sheared clean through, the metal showing bright where it had fractured under impossible stress. Muirhead had inspected storm damage at lighthouses up and down the Scottish coast. He had seen what winter gales could do to exposed structures. This was different. This spoke of forces that exceeded his experience, that pushed beyond the margins of what he believed possible. But the railings were only the beginning. Above the platform, carved into the cliff face itself, was a storage recess positioned 110 feet above mean sea level. The logic was sound enough. Equipment needed to be stored at the landings for emergency use, but it had to be protected from the ordinary run of weather. 110 feet above the sea provided that protection. In the recorded history of the Lighthouse service, in all the decades of storms that had hammered these rocks, waves had never reached anywhere near that height at this location. The recess had been torn open. A heavy wooden box that had been bolted and secured within the carved-out space was simply gone, ripped away entirely. Only splinters remained, driven like needles into cracks in the stone. The iron brackets that had held the box in place dangled loose, their mounting points fractured. Inside that box had been coils of rope, spare pulleys, tools for emergency repairs. All of it vanished, swept away by water that should never have reached that height. Muirhead stood at the base of the cliff, tilting his head back to examine the empty recess far above. He made calculations in his notebook, checking and rechecking his arithmetic. The numbers refused to cooperate with reason. For water to reach 110 feet above sea level at this point on Islay and Moor would require a wave of staggering, unprecedented proportions. The bathymetry of the seabed, the shape of the island, the exposed nature of the western landing, none of it suggested the possibility of such wave amplification. He had consulted with marine engineers before making the journey to Islay and Moor. They had discussed the theoretical maximum wave heights possible in the North Atlantic, even under the most extreme conditions. The largest waves, reliably recorded in these waters, reached perhaps 50 or 60 feet from trough to crest under hurricane force conditions. To strike the storage recess, a wave would need to be substantially larger, and it would need to hit with enough force not merely to splash, but to grip, to tear, to rip secured equipment from solid rock. Then there was the boulder. It sat now 20 feet from its original position, a massive chunk of stone that three men together could not have hoped to shift. Muirhead examined the depression where it had rested, a fitted space worn smooth by untold centuries, perhaps millennia, of occupation. Lichen grew in the protected spaces around where the boulder had sat, lichen that took decades to establish itself. This rock had not moved in living memory, possibly not in centuries. Yet, something had lifted it, transported it, and deposited it in its new resting place. The superintendent enlisted the help of the investigation team to estimate the boulder's weight. They measured its dimensions carefully, calculated its volume, factored in the density of the local basalt. Their estimate came to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 tons. Muirhead stood beside it, placing his palm flat against its cold surface. To move this mass would require extraordinary force that had to come from somewhere. The only possible source was the ocean, but accepting that meant accepting wave conditions that bordered on the impossible. He walked the landing area methodically, documenting every detail. Smaller stones had been scattered like pebbles. An iron crane fixture, designed to swing supply crates from the relief boat onto the platform, had been wrenched partially free from its moorings. The platform itself showed scour marks, long gouges in the stone where debris had been dragged across its surface by retreating water. But it was the height of the damage that continued to trouble him most profoundly. Muirhead cross-referenced his observations with the meteorological records that had been forwarded to him before the investigation. This was where the paradox deepened into something approaching impossibility. The weather station at Stornoway, the nearest point with reliable recording equipment, showed that the storm, which had battered the Hebrides in mid-December, had indeed been severe. On the 13th and 14th of December, gale-force winds had raked the islands, bringing heavy seas and dangerous conditions. Ships had remained in harbor. Fishing boats had been secured. It was the kind of winter storm the region experienced regularly. Fierce, but not unprecedented. But the records also showed something else. By the afternoon of the 15th of December, the storm had begun to break. The wind had fallen from gale force to strong breeze. The barometric pressure had started to rise. By the evening of the 15th, conditions were improving steadily, and by the morning of the 16th, the day the keepers were last confirmed to be alive, the weather had calmed to near normal winter condition. According to every instrument, every observation, the dangerous phase of the storm had passed before the middle of the month. Yet, the damage at the western landing appeared fresh. Muirhead examined the torn wood, the fractured metal, the displaced stone with the eye of an experienced investigator. There was no rust on the bright metal where the bolts had sheared. The exposed wood showed no weathering, no graying from sun exposure. Water still pooled in the depressions created by the wave's passage. Everything suggested that whatever had struck this landing had done so recently, within days of the investigation team's arrival. But if the storm had calmed by the 15th, what had created this destruction? He considered the possibility of a rogue wave, those mysterious giants that appeared seemingly from nowhere in otherwise moderate seas. Sailors had reported them for centuries, walls of water that dwarfed surrounding swells, that appeared and vanished with no warning. But even rogue waves followed certain physical principles. They occurred in deep water, generated by the constructive interference of multiple wave trains. The approaches to Eilean Moor were relatively shallow, the underwater topography well mapped. Nothing in the local conditions suggested rogue wave formation, and certainly nothing that could explain waves reaching 110 feet above sea level. Joseph Moore had been standing silently throughout much of Muirhead's investigation, but the superintendent drew him aside, seeking testimony that might illuminate the mystery. Moore had known the missing keepers personally. He had served with them, shared meals, weathered storms alongside them. If anyone could provide insight into their behavior, their judgment, their likely actions, it was him. "Tell me about their experience," Muirhead asked. "Tell me how they would have responded to storm conditions." Moore's answer was unequivocal. James Ducat had been a principal keeper with years of service, a man known throughout the Lighthouse service for his caution and professionalism. Thomas Marshall, though younger, was equally experienced, equally reliable. William McArthur, the occasional keeper filling in for the regular third keeper who was on sick leave, was perhaps less seasoned, but he was trained, competent, aware of the dangers. These were not reckless men. These were not novices who would venture onto an exposed landing platform during dangerous weather. The regulations were clear, Moore explained. During storm conditions, keepers were to remain inside the lighthouse proper unless absolutely necessary to venture out. The light itself could be maintained from within. The mechanisms were designed precisely to minimize the need for external work during rough weather. There would be no reason whatsoever, for the keepers to descend to the western landing during a gale. What? And yet, Muirhead countered, the evidence suggests that something drew at least one of them, possibly all of them, away from the safety of the lighthouse. The oilskins and boots missing from their assigned hooks suggested someone had prepared to go outside. The untouched meal on the table suggested sudden urgency. The open door, though perhaps blown open by wind, suggested that whoever had gone out had not returned to secure it. Moore shook his head slowly. Ducat would never have gone to the landing in dangerous seas, he insisted. The man was too experienced, too aware of the risks. If the storm was severe enough to generate the kind of waves that could cause this damage, Ducat would have known it. He would have heard it, felt it in the very bones of the lighthouse. The whole structure would have been shaking with each impact. Under those conditions, he would have kept his men inside, safe, waiting for the weather to pass. But what if the wave had come without warning? Muirhead proposed. What if conditions appeared calm, safe enough to venture out for some necessary task, and then something unprecedented struck? The superintendent walked to the edge of the platform, looking out across the Atlantic. The sea was moderate today, rolling swells passing beneath a gray sky. Nothing threatening. He tried to imagine it transformed, tried to envision a wave massive enough to reach more than 100 feet above where he stood. The human mind struggled with such scales. Even having seen the evidence, having measured the destruction, his imagination balked at constructing the reality that must have occurred. He returned to his measurements, to his documentation, building a case from physical facts. The bent railings spoke of forces exceeding several tons per square foot. The missing storage box required water velocity approaching that of a flash flood in a narrow canyon. The displaced boulder demanded energy transfer that made his calculations seem like fiction. And all of this impossible destruction, had occurred sometime after the 15th of December, after the recorded storm had passed, after conditions should have been safe. The investigation team worked through the afternoon, photographing, measuring, collecting samples of twisted metal and splintered wood. They lowered a survey line to measure the exact height of the damage, confirming again and again that the storage recess stood 110 feet above the winter sea level. They examined the boulder from every angle, mapping the path it must have traveled from its original position. As the light began to fail, Muirhead stood once more at the western landing, his notebook full of observations that added up to an impossibility. Something had struck Eileen Moore with devastating force. Something had generated waves that exceeded anything in the meteorological record, anything in the collective experience of lighthouse keepers and marine engineers. And that something had occurred during a period when, according to every instrument and every weather station, the storm should have been abating. The paradox was complete and unsolvable. The evidence demanded a catastrophic wave. The weather records denied its possibility. The damage appeared fresh. The storm had passed days earlier. The keepers were experienced and cautious. Yet something had drawn them from safety into the path of destruction. Every answer Muirhead found only deepened the mystery, only pushed the explanation further beyond the borders of the rational and into the realm of the inexplicable. The cold Atlantic winds have always howled around the Flannan Isles with a voice that sounds almost human, and the people of the Outer Hebrides learned long ago to listen when the islands spoke. Eileen Moore, the largest of these 7 jagged rocks rising from the gray sea, carried a reputation that predated any lighthouse, any keeper, any official record in the logbooks of the Northern Lighthouse Board. The Gaelic shepherds who knew these waters best called the island by another name in their quieter moments, a name that roughly translates to the island that watches back, and they would make the sign of the cross before even speaking of it. For centuries before the lighthouse ever cast its beam across those treacherous waters, Eileen Moore existed in that liminal space between the physical world and something altogether more unsettling. The local populations, steeped in Celtic tradition and the old ways that Christianity had never quite managed to scrub away, maintained an absolute certainty that the Flannan Isles belonged to forces that did not welcome human presence. These were not gentle nature spirits or mischievous fairies from the softer folklore of the mainland. The entities said to inhabit Eileen Moore were ancient, territorial, and utterly unforgiving of those who dared to claim dominion over their realm. The shepherds of Lewis and Harris knew this better than anyone. For generations, they had used the islands as seasonal grazing land, ferrying sheep across the turbulent waters each spring, when the grass grew thick and salt-sweet on those lonely rocks. But their relationship with Eileen Moore was never comfortable, never routine, despite the repetition of seasons. Every year brought stories that circulated through the crofting communities, whispered over peat fires on winter nights when the wind rattled the shutters and made even the bravest men check their door latches twice. Sheep would vanish in ways that defied explanation, not taken by the sea, for their bodies would have washed up on the rocks or been found broken at the base of the cliffs, not taken by eagles or any natural predator, for the islands had none large enough to carry away a full-grown ewe. The animals simply ceased to exist, as if the island itself had opened and swallowed them whole. Shepherds reported entire groups of sheep, found huddled together on perfectly safe ground, dead from no apparent cause, their eyes wide and fixed on something the living could not see. Others spoke of finding their flocks scattered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, arranged in circles or lines that felt wrong in a way that made the skin crawl. But it was not only the animals that suffered on Eilean Moor. The shepherds themselves, hardy men who thought nothing of spending weeks exposed to Atlantic storms, refused to spend nights on the island unless absolutely necessary. Those who did reported experiences that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. They spoke of footsteps that echoed across the rocks when no one else was there, of voices carried on winds that seemed to come from inside the earth itself. They described the overwhelming sensation of being observed from the shadows of the old stone structures that dotted the island, ruins so ancient that no one remembered who had built them or for what purpose. The phenomenon was consistent enough that it became woven into the fabric of island custom. Before landing on Eilean Moor, the shepherds would perform small rituals, offerings made to appease whatever waited there. They left portions of their food on specific rocks, poured whiskey into the sea at certain points, spoke phrases in the old Gaelic that their grandfathers had taught them without ever quite explaining why. These were not men given to superstition in their daily lives. They were practical, hard-working, deeply familiar with the realities of survival on the edge of the world. Yet, Eilean Moor demanded these acknowledgments, and they gave them willingly because the alternative was worse. The legend of the phantom ship added another layer of dread to the island's reputation. According to accounts passed down through generations of seafarers, a ghostly vessel appeared in the waters around the Flannan Isles before every major disaster that befell the region. Fishermen described a three-masted ship that sailed against the wind, its sails full even when the air was dead calm, moving through the waves without disturbing the water. The ship appeared always at dusk, its outline blurred as if seen through smoke or mist, and it made no sound at all despite the creak of rigging and wood that should have carried across the water. Those who saw the phantom ship knew that death was coming. Sometimes it heralded storms that would destroy fishing fleets. Sometimes it appeared before outbreaks of disease that would devastate island communities. The ship was never the same, witnesses claimed, as if it transformed with each appearance to match the era, yet it was always unmistakably the same presence, the same harbinger. Sailors who spotted it would turn their boats immediately for home, and they would not go to sea again until a full cycle of the moon had passed. The ship belonged to the islands, they said, crewed by those whom the islands had taken, forever sailing in service to whatever dark sovereignty ruled those rocks. The most disturbing chapter in Eilean Moor's dark history came from the 1700s, though the exact year varies depending on which account you trust. A small religious community, followers of a particularly austere Christian sect, established themselves on the island in an attempt to create a sanctuary isolated from the corruptions of the world. They built a chapel and simple dwellings, perhaps a dozen men and women committed to a life of prayer and contemplation in that harsh and lonely place. They believed, according to the fragments of record that survive, that the island's reputation was merely pagan superstition that would flee before righteous faith. The island had other ideas. Within a single year, every member of that religious community was dead, wiped out by what later accounts vaguely described as a plague. But the nature of this plague raised questions that were never answered. The bodies, when finally discovered by fishermen who had been asked to deliver supplies, showed no signs of the usual ravages of disease. There were no lesions, no evidence of fever or wasting. Instead, the victims appeared to have simply stopped living, found in positions of absolute terror, their faces locked in expressions of such horror that several of the fishermen who discovered them refused to ever speak of what they had seen. The religious community's chapel was found in a state that defied the timeline. Though the deaths had occurred recently, the building appeared to have aged decades in mere months. The wood was rotted through, the stone walls cracked and crumbling, vegetation growing through the floor as if the structure had stood abandoned for generations. Most disturbing of all, every religious symbol, every cross and icon the community had brought with them, had been found broken or turned to face the wall. The fishermen took nothing from that place. They left the bodies where they lay and never returned, and within a few years, the sea and the weather had erased all physical evidence that the religious community had ever existed. This story became a warning, a cautionary tale told whenever anyone proposed spending significant time on Eilean Moor. The island would not be claimed. The island would not be tamed. The island would not tolerate those who came with intentions of permanent occupation, or worse, with plans to impose order on its wild nature. And for more than a century after the plague that destroyed the religious community, people largely heeded that warning. Then came the Lighthouse. In the late 1890s, the Northern Lighthouse Board decided that the Flannan Isles, despite their reputation, required a light to guide ships through those deadly waters. The local population reacted with a mixture of resignation and dread. They knew the lighthouse was coming. They knew it was needed. But they also knew that Eileen Moore would not accept this intrusion quietly. The construction crews reported problems from the very beginning. These were experienced men, veterans of building lighthouses on some of the most inhospitable rocks in the British Isles. Yet Eileen Moore unsettled them in ways they struggled to articulate. The foreman's logs still preserved in the Lighthouse Board archives make fascinating reading. Between the dry technical details of construction progress, there are hints of something else, observations that seem almost forced onto the page by the weight of experience. Workers complained of tools disappearing and reappearing in impossible locations. They described the constant feeling of being watched from the interior of the island, from the darkness between the rocks and the shadows of the ruins. Several men refused to work alone, even in broad daylight, reporting an overwhelming sense of presence that made the air feel thick and hostile. At night, those who stayed on the island to guard the equipment heard sounds they could not explain. Low groans that seemed to come from the earth itself, rhythmic patterns that were almost but not quite music. The sensation of fear was the worst part, according to the accounts. Not the natural apprehension of working in a dangerous place, but a primal, irrational terror that would suddenly overwhelm even the steadiest men without warning or apparent cause. They would be working normally, and then a wave of absolute dread would wash over them, sending them scrambling for their boats, their tools forgotten, their only thought to get off the island immediately. The foreman noted that this happened most frequently at dusk, as the light began to fail, and he eventually instituted a policy that all workers must leave the island before sunset, a rule that significantly slowed construction, but which he deemed absolutely necessary for the mental health of his crew. When the lighthouse was finally completed in 1899, the locals viewed it not as a triumph of engineering, but as a provocation, a direct challenge to the forces that had ruled Eileen Moore since time immemorial. The first keepers were warned, though the warnings were subtle, couched in the language of weather patterns and supply difficulties, rather than outright talk of supernatural danger. But the keepers, like the religious community before them, dismissed the concerns of the superstitious locals. They were modern men, representatives of science and progress, and they would not be frightened by peasant tales. For 1 year, the lighthouse operated without incident. The keepers performed their duties, the light shone, ships navigated safely past the rocks. Perhaps Eileen Moore had finally accepted human presence. Perhaps the old stories were truly just stories after all. Then came December of 1900, and 3 men vanished from a locked island in ways that defied every rational explanation. When the relief ship arrived and found the lighthouse abandoned, the locals were not surprised. They had been waiting for this, expecting it, knowing it was inevitable from the moment the first stone of the lighthouse had been laid. The island had spoken, they said. The island had finally claimed its revenge for the years of intrusion, the decades of sheep grazing and human presence, the ultimate insult of a permanent structure lit with human fire. The spirits that dwelled in those rocks had been patient, perhaps more patient than anyone had right to expect, but their patience had limits. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald McArthur had crossed a line that the island would not permit to be crossed. In the years that followed, no amount of official investigation could shake the local conviction about what had really happened on Eileen Moore. The disappearance was not a mystery to be solved, but a confirmation of what the Gaelic populations had always known. The island watches back, and sometimes the island takes what it believes it is owed. The official inquiry into the Flannan Isles lighthouse mystery began with what seemed like a reasonable explanation, almost comforting in its simplicity. Captain Harvey had delivered his initial impressions to the Northern Lighthouse Board, and within weeks, a superintendent named Robert Muirhead traveled to the island to conduct a thorough investigation. Muirhead walked the same paths the three missing men had walked, examined the same equipment they had used, and studied the storm damage with meticulous attention. His final report, submitted in late January of 1901, presented what would become the accepted theory, the explanation that would appear in official records and historical accounts for decades to come. According to Muirhead's hypothesis, all three men had left the lighthouse tower together to secure equipment at the West Landing during what he described as a sudden and catastrophic storm surge. A massive wave, perhaps as high as 70 or 80 feet, had swept all three men into the Atlantic simultaneously, leaving no trace, no bodies, no possibility of survival. The evidence seemed to support this conclusion at first glance. Severe storm damage had been documented at the West Landing area. A toolbox had been found secured at the highest point of accessible rock, suggesting the men had been working there. The landing platform showed signs of tremendous impact from the sea. The official report concluded that the disappearance, while tragic, was ultimately explainable as a terrible accident of nature, a freak occurrence that had caught experienced lighthouse keepers off guard. But almost immediately, problems emerged with this tidy explanation. Problems that refused to be smoothed away by official reassurance. Problems that multiplied the longer anyone examined the known facts. The more closely investigators and maritime experts looked at the official theory, the more it seemed to crumble under the weight of what it failed to explain. Start with the most fundamental issue, the one that every lighthouse keeper and maritime authority understood instinctively. Under no circumstances, absolutely none, should all three men have left the lighthouse unattended at the same time. This was not merely a suggestion or a guideline. This was sacred protocol, drilled into every keeper from their first day of training. The lighthouse must always be manned. Always. Even during the worst storms, especially during the worst storms, at least one man remained inside, ready to maintain the light, to monitor conditions, to raise an alarm if something went wrong. These were not novices, not inexperienced men who might panic and make foolish decisions together. James Ducat had over 20 years of lighthouse service. Thomas Marshall was equally experienced. Even the youngest among them, Donald McArthur, had enough training to know this fundamental rule. So why would all three violate this most basic protocol? Why would they collectively abandon the one principle that might have saved at least one life? Superintendent Muirhead suggested they might have seen a piece of vital equipment in danger, something worth risking everything to save. But what equipment could possibly be important enough to justify leaving the lighthouse completely unmanned? What could be worth abandoning the light itself, the very purpose of their station? Lighthouse keepers understood priority. The light came first, always. Equipment could be replaced. The light could not be allowed to fail. Then, there was the matter of the clothing, or rather, the absence of it. The evidence suggested that Donald McArthur had rushed outside without his waterproof coat. His oilskin still hung on its peg inside the lighthouse. In December, on an exposed rock in the Atlantic, during a storm severe enough to generate waves that could sweep men away. What kind of emergency would cause an experienced keeper to run outside without his protective gear? Not a slowly developing situation where equipment needed securing. That would give time to dress properly. No. The missing coat suggested sudden panic, an immediate crisis that demanded instant response. But if the emergency was that sudden, that urgent, why would all three men respond? Why wouldn't one stay behind, maintain the station, prepare to raise an alarm? The contradictions deepened when investigators considered the timeline. The last log entry was made on the 15th of December. The Hesperus arrived on the 26th of December. At some point in those 11 days, the men vanished. But when exactly? Storm damage at the West Landing suggested violent weather, yes, but the Scottish coast had experienced multiple storms during that period. Weather records showed significant gales on the 12th and 13th, then again around the 17th and 18th. Which storms supposedly killed the men? If they disappeared during the earlier storms, why was the lighthouse still secured days later when the relief vessel arrived? If they vanished during the later storms, why hadn't they completed more recent log entries? And perhaps most troubling of all, why were there no warning notes, no messages left behind? Lighthouse protocol was clear on this point as well. If keepers needed to leave the station for any reason, they left a note explaining their actions. even in emergencies, especially in emergencies. A quick scrawl to indicate what had happened, where they were going, what danger they faced. James Ducat knew these procedures intimately. He had decades of experience. If he saw a situation developing that required multiple men to address, he would have left some indication, some record. The slate was ready. Pencils were at hand. It would take 10 seconds to write something, anything. But there was nothing. Just silence. The beds told another strange story. 2 were unmade, but 1 bed was neatly arranged, suggesting that perhaps not all 3 men had been sleeping when whatever happened occurred. But this raised more questions than it answered. If 1 man was awake on watch, as protocol demanded, why did he allow the other 2 to join him outside? Why didn't the watchkeeper stay at his post? The evidence of the bed suggested a normal rotation was in place, which made the collective abandonment of the lighthouse even more baffling. As the official theory began to show these cracks, alternative explanations emerged, each attempting to account for the evidence, each failing in its own way. The first dark whisper suggested murder, followed by suicide. Perhaps the isolation had driven 1 man mad. Perhaps tensions had exploded into violence. The isolation of lighthouse keeping was known to strain even the strongest friendships. Men lived in tiny spaces for weeks at a time, seeing the same faces, hearing the same voices, counting the same days, until relief arrived. Could James Ducat have killed the other 2 men, then thrown himself into the sea in remorse? Could Thomas Marshall have snapped, murdered his companions, then leaped to his death? But this theory collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. The men had shown no signs of conflict. Their log entries were routine, calm, professional. Captain Harvey, who knew Ducat personally, insisted the man was temperamentally incapable of violence. Colleagues who had worked with Marshall and McArthur said the same. Moreover, there were no signs of struggle inside the lighthouse, no blood, no damage, no indication of violence. The kitchen table was set. Personal belongings were undisturbed. If murder had occurred, where was the evidence? And why would a murderer carefully tidy the lighthouse, secure the doors, and arrange everything so neatly before killing himself? Other theories ventured into stranger territory. Fishermen in the Outer Hebrides had long reported unusual creatures in the waters around the Flannan Isles. Witnesses described something they called a sea serpent, a massive creature occasionally seen breaking the surface far from shore. Some locals claimed these beings could come onto land, could move with terrifying speed when threatened. Perhaps the lighthouse keepers had encountered such a creature. Perhaps they had been dragged into the sea by something unknown to science. The theory had the virtue of explaining why all 3 men might have left the lighthouse together, why they might have acted in panic, why no bodies were ever recovered. But it remained purely speculative, unsupported by any physical evidence, relegated to the realm of folklore and imagination. The lighthouse's strategic location spawned theories of foreign involvement. The Flannan Isles sat along important shipping routes. A functioning lighthouse there provided crucial navigation assistance, but it also served as an observation point. What if a foreign vessel, perhaps Russian or German, had abducted the keepers to prevent them from reporting unusual naval activity? The international political situation at the turn of the 20th century was tense. Naval powers were expanding, testing boundaries, conducting secret operations. What if the 3 men had witnessed something they were not supposed to see? But this theory also had fatal flaws. Why would foreign agents secure the lighthouse so carefully after abducting the men? Why not simply kill them on sight and leave evidence of an accident? Why take the risk of transporting prisoners when elimination would be simpler? In later years, as popular culture began to embrace the possibility of extraterrestrial visitors, some theorists suggested that the Flannan Isles disappearance represented an early alien abduction. The complete absence of bodies, the strange details, the inexplicable behavior of experienced men, all of it seemed to fit the pattern of later reported alien encounters. Proponents of this theory pointed to other mysterious disappearances in remote locations, suggesting a pattern of extraterrestrial interest in isolated humans. But like the sea serpent theory, this explanation offered no verifiable evidence, no way to test or confirm the hypothesis. It explained everything by explaining nothing, substituting one mystery for another. Each theory had its advocates, each its moment of seeming plausibility. But each also had insurmountable problems, contradictions that refused to be resolved. The murder-suicide theory could not account for the absence of violence or the character of the men. The creature theory relied on folklore and superstition without physical proof. The espionage theory required complicated plots that made little strategic sense. The alien theory ventured beyond any possibility of verification. And so investigators and theorists found themselves circling back to the original question, the central mystery that refused to yield. What happened on Flannan Isles between the 15th and 26th of December 1900? What could cause three experienced, professional, psychologically stable men to violate their most sacred protocols? What could make them all leave their posts simultaneously? What emergency could be urgent enough to send a man outside without his coat in December, yet leave time to secure doors and windows? What could erase three human beings so completely that not a single trace of their bodies was ever recovered? The most disturbing realization, the one that still echoes more than a century later, is this: no rational explanation fits all the evidence. Every theory leaves gaping holes, every hypothesis fails to account for crucial details. The official explanation of a freak wave requires us to believe that experienced men made multiple catastrophic errors in judgment. Alternative theories require us to believe in creatures, conspiracies, or phenomena for which we have no proof. We are left with an impossible situation, a mystery that seems designed to resist solution, as if the island itself consumed three men and kept its secrets locked in stone and wind and wave. The investigation ultimately concluded with uncertainty, disguised as certainty. The official records state that the men were lost to the sea during the storm. But anyone who examines the evidence closely, who considers the contradictions and impossibilities, understands that this conclusion is less a solution than a surrender. It represents our need for closure colliding with the uncomfortable truth that some events refuse to be understood, some mysteries refuse to be solved, some disappearances leave behind only questions that multiply with each attempt to answer them. The official investigation into the Flannan Isles disappearance relied on a single document, the Lighthouse log, with its final entry dated December 13th, 1900. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if there was another record, a second journal, containing entries so disturbing that someone decided they should never see the light of day? The controversy surrounding these alleged entries has divided researchers for decades. Some claim they're genuine documents that were deliberately suppressed by authorities desperate to maintain public confidence in Lighthouse operations. Others insist they're elaborate fabrications, hoaxes created to sensationalize an already mysterious tragedy. But the descriptions that have leaked out, whether authentic or invented, paint a portrait of psychological disintegration so vivid and terrifying that they become inseparable from the legend itself. According to those who claim to have seen these disputed pages, the entries began innocuously enough. Thomas Marshall, the assistant keeper who'd replaced the scheduled William Ross at the last moment, supposedly kept a personal diary separate from the official log. The early entries, dated from late November, described routine maintenance work, weather patterns, and the mundane rhythms of lighthouse life. James Ducat, the principal keeper with over 20 years of experience, ran a tight operation. Donald McArthur, the occasional keeper filling in for the assignment, was adjusting well to the isolation. Everything appeared normal. But then, around the first week of December, Marshall's alleged entries began to change in tone. He wrote about sounds at night, strange acoustic phenomena that couldn't be explained by wind or waves. The three men would be sitting in the kitchen after dinner, and they'd hear what sounded like voices calling their names. Not together, but individually, distinctly. Thomas, James, Donald, Dog. Each man would look up, thinking one of the others had spoken, only to find them staring back with the same confused expression. Marshall supposedly described how they rationalized these occurrences at first. The lighthouse stood on an exposed rock, battered by Atlantic gales. Sound behaved strangely in such an environment. Wind through crevices could create almost human-like tones. Waves echoing in sea caves below produced acoustic illusions. These were documented phenomena, nothing supernatural about them. James Ducat, with his decades of experience in remote lighthouses, assured the others that he'd heard similar things before. Every lighthouse had its peculiar sounds, he told them. The human mind always wants to find patterns, to hear voices in random noise. But the sounds continued, and according to the controversial entries, they grew more specific. Marshall wrote about being in his bunk one night, when he clearly heard his full name called from somewhere outside the lighthouse. Not just Thomas, but Thomas Marshall, pronounced with perfect clarity. He went to the window and saw nothing but darkness and spray. When he mentioned it at breakfast, Donald McArthur went pale. He'd heard it too. His own name called twice, from the direction of the landing platform. The entries from mid-December allegedly took a darker turn. Marshall described Donald McArthur's deteriorating mental state with growing concern. The occasional keeper, less experienced than his companions, began showing signs of severe anxiety. He'd stand at the windows for hours, staring out at the sea, flinching at shadows. He started refusing certain duties, particularly any work that required going outside the lighthouse tower. When asked to check the landing platform for storm damage, McArthur reportedly became agitated, insisting that something was wrong with the water, that he'd seen something moving beneath the surface in a way that waves simply didn't move. Marshall's alleged account described an incident where Donald McArthur claimed to have witnessed a shadow ascending the lighthouse stairs when all three men were accounted for in the kitchen. The shadow moved wrong, he insisted. It flowed upward rather than climbing, defying the natural movement of light and darkness. Ducat, trying to maintain rationality, checked every level of the tower. They found nothing, of course. But Marshall noted that even the unflappable principal keeper seemed shaken afterward, though he worked hard to hide it. The shared nightmares formed another disturbing thread through these disputed entries. Marshall supposedly wrote about all three men experiencing similar dreams, night after night. They were drowning, but not in a normal sense. The water that filled their lungs was wrong somehow. Too thick, too dark, alive with a cold intelligence. They'd wake gasping, and over breakfast, they'd realize they'd all dreamed variations of the same thing. How could three grown men share nightmares? Marshall asked in his journal. What did it mean? James Ducat tried to impose order and routine as a defense against the growing psychological pressure. The alleged entries describe him maintaining the lighthouse schedule with rigid precision, insisting on proper documentation, keeping everyone busy with tasks and maintenance. Work was the cure for imagination, he reportedly told the others. Keep your hands occupied and your mind won't wander. But Marshall's journal entries, if they existed, suggest that even Ducat's iron discipline was beginning to crack. In one of the most chilling alleged passages, Marshall described finding James Ducat standing motionless at the gallery windows in the middle of the night, staring out at the rocks below. When Marshall asked if everything was all right, Ducat didn't answer immediately. Then, without turning, the veteran keeper admitted that he heard them too. The voices. He'd been hearing them for days, but hadn't wanted to frighten the others by acknowledging it. He'd worked lighthouses for 2 decades, Ducat reportedly said, and he'd never experienced anything like this. Something was deeply wrong with Flannan Isles, but he couldn't explain what or why. The entries allegedly grew more fragmented and desperate as December 15th approached. Marshall's handwriting, according to those who claimed to have seen the journal, became increasingly erratic. He wrote about all three men seeing shadows that moved independently of any light source, shapes that appeared in peripheral vision but vanished when looked at directly. They saw figures standing on the rocks at dawn, but when they checked through telescopes, nothing was there. The weather had been unusually calm for several days, Marshall noted, which somehow made everything worse. The silence between waves felt expectant, threatening, as if the sea itself was waiting for something. Donald McArthur had stopped speaking almost entirely by this point. According to the disputed account, he'd sit in his bunk or stand at windows, lips moving in what appeared to be prayer, tears streaming down his face. When Ducat tried to comfort him, or get him to explain his terror, McArthur could only shake his head and whisper that it was coming, that they all knew it was coming, that there was nowhere to hide on this rock in the middle of the sea. Then came the final entry, the one that haunts every discussion of this controversy. Dated December 15, 1900, allegedly written in Thomas Marshall's increasingly shaky hand, it described the three men huddled together in the lighthouse kitchen as something approached. Marshall supposedly wrote that they could all hear it now, the sound of something vast, moving through the water toward the island. Not a ship, not a whale, something else. something that had been calling their names, invading their dreams, revealing itself in shadows and movement at the edge of vision for weeks. The entry described them crying, all three grown men reduced to tears by terror they couldn't name or explain. James Ducat led them in prayer, his voice steady even as his hands shook. They prayed for salvation, for protection, for deliverance from whatever evil had found them on this isolated rock. Marshall wrote that they could feel vibrations through the stone, now, rhythmic pulses that matched no natural phenomenon. Donald McArthur kept repeating that he was sorry, though sorry for what, he couldn't say. The alleged final sentences are brief and fragmentary. It knows we're here. It's known all along. God forgive us. And then nothing. The journal supposedly ends mid-page, the last words trailing off into an ink smear, as if the writer's hand had been pulled away from the paper suddenly. This is where fact and alleged evidence collide with official silence. The Northern Lighthouse Board's investigation made no mention of any such journal. The official stance has remained consistent for over a century. Only the standard lighthouse log existed, with its final routine entry on December 13th. No personal diary was found. No disturbing descriptions of psychological breakdown or supernatural encounters were recorded. So where did these alleged entries come from? Several theories have emerged over the decades. The suppression theory argues that the journal was found but deemed too disturbing for public disclosure. Lighthouse keeping was already a difficult profession to staff, especially at remote locations. A story about keepers driven mad by inexplicable phenomena before vanishing completely would have made recruitment impossible. Better to remove the evidence, present the mystery as unsolvable rather than horrifying, and let speculation focus on storms and accidents rather than something darker. Proponents of suppression point to inconsistencies in the official investigation. Superintendent Robert Muirhead's report was unusually brief for such an unprecedented incident. No photographs were taken of the lighthouse interior. Personal effects of the keepers were returned to families without detailed inventory. The investigation concluded quickly, perhaps too quickly, some argue. Why such haste unless someone wanted to close the case before troubling details emerged? The fabrication theory counters that the journal entries are obvious hoaxes, created years or even decades after the disappearance. They read like Gothic horror fiction, complete with mounting dread and supernatural suggestions. No credible researcher has ever produced the actual journal or even convincing photographs of its pages. The descriptions exist only in third-hand accounts, stories about stories, always frustratingly out of reach of verification. Skeptics note that the alleged entries contain certain linguistic anachronisms and dramatic flourishes inconsistent with actual lighthouse keeper diaries from the period, which tended toward terse, practical notation. The supposed journal reads too much like a crafted narrative, too perfectly structured in its escalation from normalcy to terror. Real psychological breakdown, they argue, doesn't follow such neat story arcs. There's also a middle position, that some personal writing was found, perhaps innocuous letters or a standard diary, and its contents were embellished over time through repeated retelling. A keeper noting strange acoustics becomes a man hearing his name called by invisible voices. Difficulty sleeping becomes shared nightmares. Natural anxiety about isolation becomes supernatural dread. The human tendency towards storytelling transforms mundane details into Gothic horror through decades of elaboration. What makes this controversy particularly maddening is its unfalsifiability. If the journal never existed, absence of evidence is exactly what we'd expect. But if it was suppressed, absence of evidence is also exactly what we'd expect. The mystery of the missing journal mirrors the larger mystery of the missing men, a Russian doll of uncertainties nested within each other, with truth perpetually out of reach. Yet the alleged entries persist in the literature of the case, quoted in books and documentaries, analyzed and debated, regardless of their dubious provenance. Why? Perhaps because they give voice to what the bare facts of the case imply, but cannot articulate. 3 experienced men vanished from a locked lighthouse during calm weather, leaving behind signs of departure that made no operational sense. Something happened on Flannan Isles, something that drove rational men to irrational action. The disputed journal entries, whether real or imagined, offer one explanation, however terrifying. They also tap into primal fears about isolation and the unknown. The idea that there are places where reality becomes thin, where something vast and inexplicable can reach through and touch human minds, resonates across cultures and centuries. The lighthouse, meant to be a beacon of safety and rationality, becomes instead a prison where men are trapped with their unraveling sanity and whatever lurks beyond the light's reach. The controversy will likely never be resolved. No smoking gun will emerge, no definitive proof of authenticity or fraud. But the legend of the secret journal has become inseparable from the Flannan Isles mystery, another layer of darkness around an event already shrouded in the deepest shadow. Whether those final entries describing 3 men crying and praying as something approached are historical record or elaborate fiction, they've achieved their own kind of truth through repetition and belief. They become what many people think must have happened, what feels true even if it cannot be proven. And perhaps that's the final horror. Not knowing whether the most terrifying evidence is real or imagined, whether those men faced something beyond comprehension, or simply disappeared into the realm of unanswerable questions, where their story remains frozen, eternally approaching some dark revelation that will never be completed. 123 years have passed since 3 men vanished from the Flannan Isles, and despite everything we have learned about science, weather, and human behavior, we are no closer to the truth than we were on that cold December morning in 1900. The lighthouse still stands. The beam still sweeps across those barren rocks every night, illuminating the exact stones where Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald McArthur walked into complete and utter oblivion. No bodies were ever found. No wreckage ever washed ashore. The ocean kept whatever secrets it claimed that day, locked away in depths that refused to surrender their dead. Modern investigators have returned to this mystery again and again, armed with tools and knowledge that the original searchers could never have imagined. Meteorologists have reconstructed the weather patterns for those crucial days in December 1900, creating sophisticated computer models that chart every storm, every wave, every shift in atmospheric pressure. They have confirmed that yes, massive storms did strike the islands during that period. Waves of incredible height and power crashed against those western cliffs. But here's where the models fail us. The evidence at the scene tells a story that violent weather alone cannot explain. Forensic psychologists have analyzed the sequence of events, trying to build a profile of what might have driven 3 experienced keepers to make a fatal decision. They have studied the phenomenon of group panic, the way fear can spread between people in isolated conditions. They have explored folie à plusieurs, shared psychosis, where multiple individuals begin to experience the same delusion. Could something they saw, something they heard, have triggered a collective breakdown? The theory feels almost plausible until you remember these were not nervous amateurs. These were hardened men of the sea, veterans of isolation and storm. The psychological profiles create possibilities but no certainties. Weather analysts have paid particular attention to the phenomenon of rogue waves, those monstrous swells that appear without warning, towering walls of water that can reach heights of 100 feet or more. Could such a wave have struck while all 3 men stood outside? The mathematics suggest it is possible. The Atlantic can birth these giants with terrifying unpredictability. But then we return to the evidence that refuses to fit. The oilskins left behind, the kitchen chair overturned, the stopped clock, the unfinished meal. If a rogue wave was imminent, if the men had rushed out to secure equipment or investigate danger, why were the protective coats still hanging by the door? Marine engineers have examined the structural evidence, the damaged gate, the dislodged stones at the western landing. Their conclusion matches the original assessment. Something of tremendous force did strike that side of the island. The damage was real, substantial, consistent with the impact of extreme waves during a severe storm. Yet this confirmation only deepens the mystery, because it cannot tell us why experienced keepers would have positioned themselves in the path of such danger, or why all 3 would have been outside simultaneously when their own regulations explicitly forbade such action. Historians have combed through every document, every logbook entry, every piece of correspondence related to the Flannan Isles. They have verified the timeline, confirmed the details, eliminated various romantic embellishments that crept into the story over the decades. There was no half-eaten meal on the table. There were no claw marks on the door. But stripping away the fiction does not bring us closer to fact. It simply leaves us with a cleaner, starker mystery. 3 men vanished. The physical evidence suggests both storm damage and unexplained behavior. The logbook gives us McArthur's strange entries about the storms and Ducat's emotional state, then falls silent. The silence is absolute. In 1971, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse joined the march toward automation. Human keepers were withdrawn, replaced by machinery that required no sleep, felt no fear, suffered no loneliness. Technology had rendered the lighthouse keeper obsolete, ending a profession that stretched back centuries. But even after automation, people still had to visit the island. Maintenance crews made regular trips to service the equipment to ensure the light continued its eternal watch over those treacherous waters. And it was these workers, these practical technicians of the modern age, who reported something that official records rarely acknowledge. Many spoke of unease, a feeling that intensified the longer they remained on the island. Some reported strange sounds when the wind picked up, not just the expected howl of air through rocks, but something else, something that almost resembled voices calling from the cliffs. Tools would be found moved from where they had been carefully placed. Doors that had been secured would stand open. These men, trained professionals with no investment in ghost stories, nonetheless found themselves checking over their shoulders, counting the hours until the relief boat would arrive. Several requested never to be assigned to Flannan Isles again, though few would elaborate on their reasons beyond a simple statement that the place felt wrong. The physical evidence remains, preserved in archives and museums. Photographs of the logbook pages. Reports from the original investigation. The records are meticulous, yet they create what experts now call a perfect void of explanation. Every piece of evidence is real, verified, documented. Taken individually, each element has a possible rational explanation. The storm damage is consistent with severe weather. The overturned chair could be an accident. The unfinished duties could reflect a sudden emergency. But when you place all the pieces together, when you step back and view the complete picture, no single explanation can account for everything. It is like a jigsaw puzzle, where every piece is genuine, but they come from different boxes, creating an image that cannot exist yet somehow does. The absence of remains haunts the investigation most of all. The sea gives up its dead eventually. Bodies surface, wreckage washes ashore, evidence appears on beaches miles from where disaster struck. Ships sink, and years later, fishermen snag remnants in their nets. But from Flannan Isles, nothing. Not a body, not a shred of clothing, not a single personal effect beyond what was found in the lighthouse itself. It is as if the men did not fall into the water, but simply ceased to exist, erased from reality itself with a completeness that nature rarely achieved. The lighthouse still stands, exactly as it stood on that December morning in 1900, when the Hesperus found it abandoned. The mechanism has been upgraded, the light modernized, but the tower remains, a stone sentinel on an island that has become synonymous with inexplicable loss. Every night, its beam sweeps across those empty rocks, across the western landing, where the gate was torn from its moorings, across the cliff paths, where 3 sets of footprints led away from safety and into legend. The light illuminates nothing but stone and sea, and the eternal questions that circle this place like seabirds riding the wind. Tourists sometimes visit now, drawn by the mystery, hoping perhaps to feel some echo of that December day. They stand where the keepers stood, look out at the same merciless ocean, try to imagine what could have driven 3 men to vanish so completely. But the island keeps its secrets. The wind howls the same incomprehensible language it has always spoken. The waves crash with the same blind fury. And the visitors leave, unsettled in ways they cannot quite articulate, carrying with them the haunting certainty that something happened here, something that resists every attempt at rational explanation. Perhaps this is why the Flannan Isles mystery endures while other disappearances fade into footnote. It is not just that 3 men vanished. People vanish all the time, lost to accident or misadventure, or the simple cruelty of circumstance. What makes Flannan Isles different is the perfect nature of the void they left behind. Everything about the scene suggests a story, but it is a story written in a language we cannot read, with crucial pages torn out, leaving us with a narrative that begins and ends, but has no middle. Some mysteries perhaps are meant to remain unsolved. Not because we lack the tools to solve them, not because evidence was destroyed or witnesses have died, but because the truth exists in a space our minds cannot comfortably occupy. The Flannan Isles may be one of these mysteries, a question that continues to echo across more than a century, not despite our investigations but because of them. Every attempt to explain only reveals new impossibilities. Every solution creates new problems. And so the mystery endures, perfect and complete. A hole in reality that refuses to be filled. The lighthouse beam sweeps on through the darkness, as it has for more than 100 years, illuminating empty rocks where 3 men walked into oblivion. The wind still carries their story across the waves. The sea still guards whatever truth it claimed. And somewhere in that space between the known and the unknowable, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald McArthur remain forever frozen in their final moments, whatever those moments were. The island knows. The ocean knows. But they will never tell. Some secrets, it seems, are meant to stay buried in the deep, where even light cannot reach, and where questions echo forever without answer. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more. Right now, drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.